Hi, everyone. This is Carmel Craig with ABH, and I just wanted to let you know that we're waiting for a few other participants to join us, so we're going to give it a couple more minutes. So thank you for being patient, and the presentation will start in just a couple more minutes. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Megan Thompson from ABH, and before I turn it over to Carmel Craig here at ABH and Beth Lucas, I am going to walk you through a little bit of housekeeping for the webinar. So when you're joining the webinar, you had the option to join by computer audio or phone call. If you did join by computer audio, we do strongly recommend that you actually use the phone call option. When you click that, there will be a conference number you can call into. The reason being, we've had, just through our experience in the past on webinars, it seems that folks on their computer audio have had more difficulty with the audio going in and out, whereas the phone call has been more consistent for people. So we do recommend that. There will be time at the end of the presentation today to submit questions. The way that you'll submit questions is that they're in your GoToWebinar control panel where you have the audio tab. There's also a questions tab. So if you click that, there's a text box area where you can enter your question and then click send. And then again, at the end of the presentation, the presenters will go through the questions and get to as many as time allows for. If you have technical issues just with the webinar software beyond the things I'm walking you through today, please call 877-582-7011. That's the GoToWebinar help desk, and they will be able to help you with any additional technical difficulties, which I hope you do not have. As a note, today's presentation is being recorded. So as soon as that is done, we will make that available. We will also be making sure the recording has closed captioning on it. That takes 3 to 5 business days. So as soon as we get that for the recording. We will post that as well. There's also in your control panel, there is a handout tab. I believe there's one handout under there that you can access. So you can click the handout and download it at any time during the presentation. Once the presentation is over, you will no longer be able to download that. So I would recommend downloading the handout now. And then we will also send it out in any follow-up email after the meeting. So that is it in terms of housekeeping. So just give me one moment. I'm going to pull up the actual presentation. And turn it over to Carmel.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm so glad that we have quite a few participants and attendees today, and I'm hoping that everyone was able to join. Today's presentation is the Self-Sufficiency Matrix Guidance, and this is presented in conjunction between the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health and ABH. So we'll get right to it. We're hoping to leave plenty of time for questions. So we expect that the presentation should only go for about an hour or so, if that. Depends how in-depth we get. But we're trying to leave plenty of time for questions with respect to the matrix itself, the matrix tool. So let's continue. Oh, sorry about that. So today's agenda will be introductions, review of the self-sufficiency matrix, the process of how we developed the guidance, the review of the guidance documents. We're going to go through 2 vignettes that address particular scenarios, as well as then seeing how they play out in particular domains of the self-sufficiency matrix. We're not going to go through all the domains, just so that people are aware. Then we'll do take time for questions and answers, and then we'll have a wrap-up session. So let's get into the introductions. I'm Carmel Craig. I'm the Vice President for Youth and Adult Mental Health Services with the Association for Behavioral Health Care. We have Julie Elias, who is the Senior Director of Operations of Mental Health Services with ServiceNet, and she is on the line. And we have Beth Lucas, Assistant Commissioner with the Department of Mental Health. So the first thing we're going to go through is the review of the self-sufficiency matrix itself. So it was the Arizona self-sufficiency matrix that we started with. And the matrix was developed initially by the Arizona Evaluation Project on Homelessness, which addressed the need to improve the measurement of program impacts at the client level. This tool was selected from among several tested and was found to be both reliable and valid. The tool has been modified for use with other populations, so various versions with expanded or varied domains are in use in other states as well. It's considered an objective measure of all things that contribute to self-sufficiency. So why did DMH select the SSM? Movement toward recovery and transition from service are fundamental to the vision and design of the ACCS. So stakeholder sessions confirmed that the Arizona SSM tool would support the following key aspects of the model: supporting enrollees to achieve independence, the use of natural supports and less reliance on the service system, ensuring sufficient transition from the service and pathway back to services when needed, and measuring and addressing barriers to movement. So how are DMH and ACCS providers using the SSM? It organizes key findings of the assessment in the context of life domains that contribute to self-sufficiency. It informs the development of objectives and interventions. It contributes to the level of care review. And it provides a thread to monitor progress and barriers from referral to transition from the service. Now I'll turn it over to Julie to talk about the process to develop the guidance.
So the process to develop the guidance, ACCS had the startup, and I don't think, thank you, and the self-sufficiency matrix. As mentioned before, it's been adapted in a variety of settings and across many states, and several versions of the tool are available in the public domain. DMH did confirm the use of the Arizona version. Number of systems and various states have developed guidance and documents and training materials to support the implementation. During the startup, ACCS providers developed internal workflows and training materials during the startup. What we recognized was that during the startup, providers were developing internal workflows and training materials, and for consistency, an ACCS documentation committee was set up to review clinical documentation requirements and identify implementation issues with current MSDP form set. The committee completed a map of the ACCS requirements and MSDP form set. We did confirm that the current MSDP form set met the requirements with one minor change that we wanted to add, and that was adding the expert screening question to the MSDP form. The remaining questions we found were related to the self-sufficiency matrix. So we realized we needed to identify the need for consistent guidance. We discovered that there were variations. Questions arose regarding the application within the ACCS model. And during level of care reviews, there seemed to be differences between the ACCS providers amongst themselves and also with the DMH staff in interpreting scores and level of care reviews. So the work group reviewed various guidance documents, and we came up with one that was the best that we thought could be modified and put out. The good match was the LifeWorks self-sufficiency matrix. A number of providers were using this, and the work group confirmed with LifeWorks manual developers that we could adapt the manual. So we adapted the manual, and in the manual there is a key guidance within the SSM scale, and you will find this when you look at the guidance, that it is in the Roman numeral I through, I believe, XI, so 1 through 11 Roman numerals. And then there's a more in-depth detail for each domain. It's usually 1 to 2 pages of guidance for each domain.
So this is Beth Lucas. Good afternoon. I'm going to walk us through the next section, which is reviewing the guidance documentation itself. At this point in the presentation, if you have printed a copy or have access to a copy of the self-sufficiency matrix guidance that was sent out along with the webinar material, it may be helpful for you to have that available to kind of look along as we go through. I will be, as I'm talking, going back and forth between the matrix itself, which has the added column with the guidance on the right-hand side in the front of the manual, as well as the more detailed 1 to 2 page guidance for each domain. So the self-sufficiency matrix, the rating scale, the rating that is determined, reflects the current, not historical, but the current objective status of the person's self-sufficiency in the domain area. What the score does not reflect is the degree of work the person and staff are doing in the domain. Part of our discussion in developing the matrix was kind of peeling back that oftentimes in these areas there is a significant amount of work that's happening to support the person and to engage in skill building or other activities to kind of support their independence and movement towards self-sufficiency. But the scale is intended to capture the current objective status of where the person is now. It also does not reflect the level of intervention or support provided by the ACCS program, and you'll see that in some of the domain areas and the examples that we go through. It's what the person either has access to or the ability to do kind of regardless of the environment, the support that's provided in the environment that they're in. And the rating is also independent of the person's goals or interests. The self-sufficiency matrix allows for the score itself, and then there's a separate way to capture whether that domain area is an interest or goal of the person. So there is a separation between the rating itself and then the goal or interest of the person. I think in general, from our experience of developing this guidance and talking through a number of scenarios, is to really look very objectively at the information in the guidance and what we know about the person you're working with. And in general, kind of the guidance is do not overthink. kind of like taking a test. Don't read too far into the question. Okay, next slide. We're just pausing a moment to advance the slides. We're having a little technical difficulty in just advancing.
There we go.
Okay. So now what we're going to do is we will walk through a detailed example of one of the domains. And so we're going to walk through the housing domain. This should look familiar to those of you who are using the self-sufficiency matrix. You notice the domain of housing on the far left, and then the scale of 1 through 5 with kind of the description of each rating for housing, and the space to record a score and to indicate whether this is a goal of the person. What the documentation work group did was to identify some real key guidance that we thought were the kind of probably most commonly asked questions or the kind of most significant guidance to inform the rating. But it does not provide a lot of the context and the definition to why. And so that's what you'll see in the more detailed page on housing. So there's three, you'll notice that we have kind of 3 words in red to kind of indicate why, to link this together with the guidance. So a rating scale of 2 indicates that the person is in transitional, temporary, or substandard housing and or current rent mortgage is unaffordable. So what we needed to do was to define what we meant by transitional, and or in our case, to turn that around, what rating do you use when a person is in a GLE? And so as you can see, the guidance on the right is that using a rating of 2 for all individuals who are currently residing in a GLE. Stable, as you'll see when we go on to the next few slides, indicates that the person has, one condition is that they have DMH rental assistance, and that there is no distinction between sponsor or tenant-based subsidies for this scoring purposes. So all individuals with a DMH rental assistance would be in the rating category of 3. And then a rating category of 4, kind of defining the subsidized housing, is looking at all other kind of more mainstream subsidies, such as Section 8. So now we'll go on and kind of show some sections of the housing guidance document. So if you're following along on in your guidance document, housing is actually the first domain, and it begins on page 1. And so this is some of the language in that detailed guidance page. And so it describes that the rating scale of 2, again, indicates the transitional, temporary, or standard. The transitional, this guidance continues on by defining what is meant by transitional housing. It refers to a housing initiative that offers long-term temporary housing for up to 24 months, and typically including a range of supportive services. I'll just pause here and kind of make a note that one of the challenges in using a manual that was developed by another system of care or in another state was that not all of the terms or definitions quite fit our population. And so since we were given permission to change the guidance, the manual, we did so, but I think we are still finding some elements that we probably still need to make final edits on, and we'll speak to that in the end. But I just wanted to call out that in this purposes, it's defining transitional housing for up to 24 months. I think we'll likely take that up to 24 months out because we know that individuals can stay in GLEs for relatively short period of time or some for multiple years. And so we do want to reflect that we do consider GLEs to be a transitional housing, but that it's not, our system doesn't put a time limit on it. It does give examples, though, of other settings, aside from GLEs, that are considered transitional, temporary, or substandard. So moving on to the next slide, we see further definition of the term stable housing. So the category rating of 3 indicates that the person is in stable housing that is safe but only marginally adequate. So what is meant by stable housing? It's defined as housing in which the client is able and likely to continue residing. However, the definition for adequacy considers the legal security of the tenure. So the fact that with DMH rental assistance, sponsor-based, that the provider is typically the leaseholder in that arrangement, and in tenant-based, while the client themselves hold the lease, there is still the expectation that the person is a DMH client and receiving case management. So because of those factors, we've determined that anyone who is receiving DMH rental assistance is identified at a rating scale of 3, because that does indicate the kind of extent of the self-sufficiency they have. They're in that kind of environment, but they're not able to kind of transfer that beyond their current situation in treatment. And then the last definition on housing that we wanted to highlight was around building capacity. And so this is a situation in which the household is in safe, adequate, and subsidized housing. And so the definition describes that this is referring to government-supported housing for individuals with low to moderate income. Can come from a variety of different sources and take different forms. For us, we commonly see that as Section 8, but there certainly are other types of affordable housing options out there that are not specifically tied to a service delivery model. So now what we would like to do is to share some relevant sections of the guidance in other domains. In general, we identified the select guidance either based on what we knew from ongoing discussions with providers and DMH staff where there was confusion, and also in the process of developing this guidance where we had the most discussion as a group. This does not reflect all of the detail within the guidance, but these are, again, just some things that we wanted to be able to highlight. So in excuse me. In the employment domain, we wanted to point out that some domains allow for a not applicable option, and we have identified through the guidance which domains a not applicable would pertain, and employment is one of them, in which you can select NA for those individuals who do self-identify as being retired. In the income domain, we gave specific guidance related to rep payee, and that predominantly most individuals with a rep payee, it would indicate a score of 2. But we wanted to recognize that for some individuals that actually do demonstrate the skill for self-managing their income, but for a number of reasons may still have the rep payee in place, that a score of 3 would be indicated in that situation. The part of the difference between a score of a 2 and a 3 is spontaneous or inappropriate spending. So an individual that's really kind of learned that self-management skill could have a score of 3. With food, anyone who is residing in a GLE environment and is receiving SNAP benefits would indicate a score of 2, and this is unrelated to any collection of SNAP benefits for the purposes of the GLE environment. So if the person is in a GLE and has SNAP benefits, a score of 2 would be indicated. Within adult education, one clarification was that there's a lot of detail in this domain about the different rating scale and how it applies, but this does include education related to employment only. There have been kind of questions and conversation about education kind of for pursuit of leisure, self-development, and so forth. And any participation of that sort would be captured under community involvement. In the life skills domain, this I think, is a very complex one for us because this represents a significant part of what ACCS may be working with an individual on, and so it's a lot of skill and activity that's kind of packed into a single domain. The way in which the rating scale is laid out, it really represents a global score in which complex life skills are prioritized. So you'll see rating scales of kind of related to 1 and 2 are situations in which individuals need kind of cueing and significant support around basic life skills such as self-care, whereas ratings at the higher end of the scale relate to individuals who are demonstrating kind of ability to perform complex life skills independently. And the rating is also represents the ability of the person to complete ADLs without consideration for available support, such as in a GLE environment. So particularly with some of the more complex life skills, such as, meal preparation, shopping, using public transportation, it's really about their ability to perform those tasks, not whether they're doing those tasks within the environment. So if meals are prepared within the group living environment, but you're assessed that they have those skills to do that, you're assessing based on those skills and not what's offered within the environment. That gives us a nice segue into the mobility measure, where we actually had a lot of discussion in this area. Because as you apply the scale, it is not a measure of the provider's capacity to deliver transportation, such as transportation for clients in a group living environment. It's about their access to available transportation, kind of independent of the provider. And it's also not a measure of the client's ability to access the skill involved in accessing transportation. As we just said, that one is reflected in life skills. So this indicator has a big geography is a major variable involved in this. So think about if an individual is living in a group living environment in which it's a more remote setting, in which there is not public transportation and the person doesn't have kind of access to transportation outside of the GLE. Even though the ACCS provider may be meeting all of their transportation needs, you would be rating them that they have no access to transportation, because if that resource was not available to them, they would not have it. If they're living in an environment where they have ready access to public transportation, or they have other forms of reliable transportation, then they would be rated accordingly. The next domain is mental health. Again, another domain where, of course, which represents a significant focus of the ACCS service. The rating scale for mental health reflects both the symptoms that the person is experiencing, the client is experiencing, in addition to the impact of those symptoms on their ability to kind of manage and function in their environment. And finally, the last few that we wanted to go through with you, substance use and addictive behaviors. We revised this guidance to really align with DSM-5 and to make sure that it was consistent with harm reduction approaches, and that it also reflects how to rate an individual when they are utilizing medication-assisted treatment. In the safety domain, this domain is really about determining the safety of the environment in which the person is in. This question has come up quite a bit, and this domain does not include self-harm or suicidality. This would be reflected in the mental health domain. And finally, disabilities and physical health. First to call out in the original matrix, this domain is called disabilities. We, for the purposes of the guidance, kind of expanded that to say disabilities and physical health, because if you read the rating scale, it really relates to a person's physical health conditions as well. So this domain includes both acute and chronic physical health conditions, but it does not include the mental health conditions. Again, that would be represented in the mental health domain. And it reflects the extent to which these medical conditions, whether they are acute or chronic, are affecting having an impact on the person's functioning, including in the areas of housing, employment, and social interactions.
Thank you, Beth. We're now going to go over two vignettes. Vignette number 1 I'll read, and then we'll look at 8 domain areas. We'll scale them. So Jane is in her 50s, resides in the GLE. Most of her life has been spent struggling with symptoms of schizophrenia. She experiences delusions and can be very fearful of familiar service providers and people she has known for many years. She showers infrequently unless prompted by staff. Although public transportation is readily available, she is unable to use it on her own due to her fears. Jane attends clubhouse program during the day when transported by staff, but does not engage in activities or interact constructively with the other participants. She considers herself to be retired and is not involved in work-related activities. Jane calls her rep payee multiple times during the month, stating she's out of money, although she receives a weekly check for spending. She will sometimes take her psychiatric medications, but usually declines her health medications that regulate her high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes. So if we were going to scale the housing, in this particular instance, the fact that she's in a GLE, we would give her a rating scale of 2. When we're looking at employment, again, this is where questions arose. What if someone says they're retired? This is a category in which you can select NA, so we would score it an NA. Her income, remember with rep payee, you can choose either a 2 or a 3. By the fact that she is calling saying she's out of money, would score her as a 2, because there must be some, we would think that there's some impulsive spending there. In life skills area, we see that she has fears, so she's not taking transportation. We also see that she needs cueing for self-care. So her basic needs are not being met, so we again will score her as a 2. The mobility, she does have access to public transportation, so she does have that available to her. So she scored a 5. Again, if she was in a GLE that was in one of the hill towns or wasn't on a bus route, she didn't have a ability for an Uber or anything, this would be scored differently. But she does have access, so it's scored as a 5. She really is socially isolated. Her community involvement is limited, so we're scoring her as a 2. And then we look at her mental health, and symptoms are interfering with her functioning. She can't take, her fears for the transportation. So again, that would be scored as a 2. Physical health, although she declines her health medications that regulate her high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes, there's no indication that she's experiencing any symptoms that are interfering with functioning. It may not be well controlled, but it's not interfering with her functioning, so she scores a 3. Again, this would change to a 2 if she was having more kind of chronic physical issues related to the high blood pressure or the type 2 diabetes. So if you have questions on those, you can always add the questions to the chat and we can answer them after vignette number 2.
We'll just pause it there for a moment just so that people can review it, just so they can see very quickly how the scoring played out. Okay, so I will move on to vignette number 2. So John is a 22-year-old male who lives alone in a DMH subsidized apartment. He has a car, goes to college, and works part-time. John is studying to be a nurse. He has friends in the nursing program and out of the program and spends time with them when he is not working or studying. Sometimes he spends time with his family who live nearby. John goes out occasionally for drinks with his friends and attends campus parties, but these activities do not impair his functioning. he has received a loan which he is unable to pay back because of his school and car expenses. John is in contact with the outreach team, but does not need much assistance from them. He has been going to the day program, but his other activities do not allow him to attend regularly. When John does attend, he is involved in the young adult activities and can be supportive of other people in the program. He has considered being a mentor, but recognizes his time constraints. John reports he has managed his symptoms of anxiety, paranoia, and mood lability over the past year by attending weekly counseling as well as monthly medication management with his psychiatrist, and that they regularly assess for needed changes in his recovery plan. They check to make sure his medications are in order. John and his team are working with DMH on converting to a tenant-based rental subsidy in preparation for a transition from ACCS. So in assessing John on the SSM, I would start with housing. And John, obviously, as it states, is living in a DMH subsidized apartment. So because of this, he has stable housing, but I would be assessing him at a 3, or rating him at a 3 on the scale. John also works part-time, as we've been told. And because of that, that would be a scale rating of 2 because he's not receiving any benefits, it's part-time, we're not really sure how long he'll be able to keep that job. His income, as we've heard, the next domain that I would be looking at would be income. And the fact that he is not able to pay his loan, and we're not sure what kind of loan this is, but due to his school and car expenses, is affecting him. So that again would lead to me to have a scale in the income domain of a 2. However, John is enrolled in the nursing program. Clearly, for adult education, that domain would be very much that he is looking to move forward, that he is moving along in his education towards his career, expanding what he intends to be doing for his career movement, and so I'd be scaling him at a 4. When we move into life skills domain, it appears from everything that we have read in this vignette and we've heard about John is that he is able to provide beyond his basic needs. I would say that if the loan piece wasn't thrown in, we might even go a little bit higher, but I would be scoring him at this point as a 4. With respect to family and social relations, he has friends and he sees his family, but in this regard, it doesn't appear that he's expanding beyond his social relations at this point in time. We don't hear about him sort of joining new groups or expanding beyond his usual activities. So I would have to keep him at a 4 and scale him at that in this regard. With mobility, he has access to transportation as he owns his own car. So that would be scored at a 5. With respect to the mental health domain, we've heard how John meets regularly with respect to weekly counseling and a monthly medication management with a psychiatrist, and so that would be scored at 5. And I would also be looking at the substance use and addictive behaviors, and although John drinks alcohol, there's no evidence of recurrent or dangerous use, if you will, so I'd be scoring him at a 4. So let's look at the actual domains themselves. So here are the ratings. If you just want to look at those very quickly, and we can get into the questions, if there are any at the end. Okay. So, Now we have time for questions.
So as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, in the control panel of the webinar, there's a tab that says questions. If you click the little arrow next to that, it will expand and have a text box down below where you can type in and then click send to submit your question.
So the first question we have is, would Uber or rideshare count towards public transportation availability?
I would say yes, so long as the ability to use Lyft or Uber was within the person's financial capabilities.
We don't have a question, but we have a comment that someone has expressed that this was very helpful to them. But we're ready for more comments, and I'm sure people have questions, so please. So how does the fact that the person is afraid to take the bus and won't use it?
So in that one, I think it's important to parse out the reason why the person is not accessing the public transportation. So if it's because of a fear related to their mental health, anxiety, trauma, paranoia, then that would be reflected within the mental health domain because it's demonstrating both the presence of the symptom, but also the rating scale accounts for the impact of that on the person's functioning. So it may be reflected in their ability to utilize public transportation or in other elements of their life, but that is where that one would be. But the other question I would ask is it related to a skill need? So does the person not demonstrate the skills to be able to follow and organize themselves to be able to access transportation? And in that case, that would be reflected within the life skills domain. I think one thing to keep in mind, what's really important about this domain, is that it includes factors that we typically consider, like the impact of symptoms, like the skills to perform life skills. But it also includes other factors in a person's life which affect their ability to be self-sufficient. So, for example, their access to housing, to income, to be able to afford food. Those are not rating their skill set around it, but more whether those things are accessible and available to them. And they're important for us to consider within the self-sufficiency matrix because they can be barriers to movement or to further independence for an individual. So, for example, I think we know all too well in our system that an individual who may have all of the skills and abilities to be able to live independently but doesn't have access to affordable housing will most likely remain in the setting that they're currently in unless that's addressed. And so the scale allows us to identify both those environmental or systemic factors in addition to factors that are really being influenced directly by treatment. That's a long answer, I apologize.
So the next question is there a requirement for the scores to be totaled or averaged at the bottom of the SSM?
The answer to that is they're measuring different things. It's a Likert scale, and therefore totaling them really doesn't give you an accurate number. There are some domain areas that are an A, so if you score an NA, there would be no points in that. So you really can't use a total. You need to measure change within the domain area, not as all the domains together.
Okay. And the next question is, somewhat related to that as to how long do you estimate it will take to complete this matrix? Julie, do you have a sense of how long it actually takes?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your knowledge of the individual and your knowledge of the matrix. So the first few times you're having to look at the matrix and look at the guidance more carefully, so it is going to take longer. But as you go through, this actually is really kind of objective and should be able to be scored fairly quickly. I don't have an exact time, but I think it, shouldn't take that long.
Sure. Now, this is a good question regarding the nuances. So in 16-hour GLEs, individuals are required to cook. Do we rate them based on their skill, or do we rate them a 2?
So for the skill of domain, the domain of life skills, it is always on their ability to perform the task, regardless of what support is or is not provided. So if the person is able to cook, whether the environment provides meals or not, you're rating the person's ability.
So the next question is, wouldn't we consider external factors when considering employment? For example, John isn't working full-time because he's going to school.
So I think that's a really interesting question to illustrate the not overthinking. So if you think about this from a self-sufficiency standpoint, for an individual who is going to school, has loans, and is part-time employed, that it speaks to their self-sufficiency in a different way. So each domain is being rated individually. This is not necessarily meant to demonstrate the totality of the progress that John is making. We read this vignette, and I think we all kind of celebrate where John is, that this is someone who really is nearing the successful completion of treatment. But regardless of that, in John's life, as he continues to progress, at some point he may be looking at full-time employment when he is done with school. But at the current state, he is working part-time, and so rating the employment scale would be a rating of 2.
Now, hopefully I'm describing this accordingly. So how does access to PT1 and the ride figure in the mobility domain?
In the guidance, when you look in the guidance, it does comment on the PT1, and it also has to deal with some areas the PT1 is reliable, and in other areas PT1 is less reliable, and you need to take that into consideration, and the domain area gives guidance on that piece.
All right, the next question is in vignette 2, can you talk more about why life skills was not rated as a 5? And so in that regard, I remember it. I was going to say, probably the more clinicians in the group could speak to this better than myself, but in the totality of what if you looked at the definitions of in the guidance, he was only able to provide beyond his basic needs. He was not able to reach, if you will, the next particular measure. And I think that was because of where he was at that point in time with respect to all of the factors that were going on in his life. So in the first example, the client is going to the clubhouse, but the community involvement score is low. Julie, did you hear that?
Yeah, sorry, I had put it on mute.
That's fine.
It has to do with the social skills. And so if you look at the vignette in number one, it comments on not, sorry, I'm just pulling it up here, does not interact constructively with other participants. So it has to do with the skill of the interactions with others.
I think we did, and this may be where the question is coming from. I'm just looking even at the domain, the guidance itself. We did indicate that a clubhouse, participating in a clubhouse was included or as community involvement, but as Julie said, it's both the involvement, it's the participation in, so the fact that she's attending, but not participating. If she was regularly participating in work order day or in kind of social activities at the clubhouse, then she would have a higher rating in that domain.
So the next question is, how would we rate an individual who lives with family in housing? I would not clinically consider it a 5 as if they moved into a subsidized apartment. They would go from a 5 to a 4, however. That would be considered a positive transition as they move on to independence. Would it make sense to rate them at a 2 like a GLE?
So in that case, I would rate them as a 5. They are in mainstream housing that's considered kind of stable and relatively permanent until they make a choice themselves. So yes, in this situation, if a person decided to move out and in doing so was able to obtain a Section 8 voucher, then they would be going to a rating scale of 4. And, you know, this is one of those situations in which, you know, we, in general, we want, you know, I think we expect to see kind of movement to higher scores. In this case, moving from a 5 to 4 is not in any way an indication of a decrease in functioning. It's just a decrease in the fact that his income the limitations of his income necessitates a affordable housing option in order for him to have stable housing.
So the next question, I believe, relates to the guidance that accompanies the matrix. So how come there are not correlating numbers to all bullets in the guidance? I'm not sure.
If I'm kind of reading the question accurately, I think, quite frankly, it's a limitation of space. Okay. We wanted to be able to, we thought that the self-sufficiency matrix itself could be, something that might be a standalone and, could be readily accessible, and we wanted it to kind of be those most frequently or kind of the high-level questions asked. The detailed guidance goes rating by rating in giving more further instructions.
Is this SSM different than level of care being done by DMH in trying to score the instrument for various domains and then in totality? How will DMH measure this given the lack of a binary number where NA is selected? Other states do look at totals.
So, yes, it is the same. The self-sufficiency matrix is only one piece of the data and information that is considered in the level of care review. I do first of all want to say again that that kind of explicitly that the intent is not to assign kind of judgment to the rating scales. Again, it's just an objective reflection of where the person is currently at. It's not intended to be the sole measure of progress, and in fact, in some ways, it is not a good measure of progress, because a person could be making progress, but yet they're not moving in the rating scale because of an external factor in their environment. So it is one piece of information. Again, we're not totaling scores, and we're not through the level of care process. While we have kind of a guided way of thinking about level of care and what a person's needs are, the level of care is intended to be really individually applied. So it gives us a framework to have a conversation between DMH and the provider about what the person's current needs and capacities are and what environment they would kind of are their best suited for continuing their services in ACCS.
So the next question is, under disabilities, physical health, how would you rate an individual who has not yet seen a dentist in 10 years, and 2 years ago they told us they had pulled a rotten tooth out with their fingers, but currently are not having any tooth issues, or so they say? True life question.
Yes.
I think in this case, we're all going to the guidance, and this is where you'd go to the more in-depth guidance. So you can hear the shuffling of papers. Again, it might be 2, depending, because if you look at 2 vulnerable, sometimes or periodically has acute or chronic symptoms. And so you want to look at what kind of that definition is. If they're pulling rotting teeth out, are there other symptoms? I think you might have to dig a little deeper on that one. I don't know. Beth?
I agree. I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. So are providers getting the same guidance? And my response to that will be that this webinar was offered to all ACCS providers and all staff who wish to participate. It was, offered broadly, but it is also being recorded as we speak, and then it will be up on our ABH's YouTube channel. We should have that up probably in a couple of weeks for everyone, and we'll let people know. We'll provide a link to it, and so that can be shared throughout. And so whoever would like to watch it can do so, and people who were not able to attend can look at the video at that point in time.
We will also be posting the guidance document itself, I believe both on the ABH website, but also on the DMH website as well.
And I also, and I don't mean to just, I should also acknowledge that there are many DMH staff who are also participating on the webinar today, so thank you very much as well. So they are aware of these questions and also aware of how the SSM is being used. So I'd like to acknowledge their participation today. Okay, so the next question is, if a person is on SSDI due to physical or mental health problems, would we rate this as an A?
I'm not sure what domain this is referring to. If this is the income domain, the question is asking about the income domain or the physical health domain. If the person who entered that question could clarify, that would be helpful. We'll skip that until we see a second response.
And this is a question, are SIE considered the same as GLE?
For the purposes of transitional, yes. Okay. Yes. And we should
They should make that note, yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Which are all the domains where an NA rating is allowed? So that is actually located on the matrix itself. You'll see it on, right below the actual domain name. If you go to the self-sufficiency matrix, it's in the far left-hand column right under the name of the domain. I don't know if that helps on that question, but you can see it quickly if you look through the document. Back to our original question on SSDI, that question is related to the employment section.
I would recommend that you apply the rating scale for employment unless the person is identifying themselves to be retired, because many individuals who are on SSDI have a goal of returning to work and are actively working unemployment as a service goal. So I would recommend that you apply the rating scale in that situation and use a score of a rating of 1, which indicates no job.
And I'm looking at the guidance section. Can you speak to the section of childcare where it states, consider pets in relationship to this category? Good question. Julie, do you want to take that one on?
Well, I think we all care about animals, and animals are, for some individuals, their children. We need to rate kind of where they're at their ability to actually care. And so that's why we put pets in this category. So, you know, their housing, is it going to affect their housing, for example, if they have a pet? Well, the other is also, do they have care for the pet if they're in school or are away for nights?
I also want to use this question as a way to highlight, and we should have done this in this kind of some of the guidance we had gone over earlier, that we ended up expanding this domain to be considered dependent care category, because we realized that oftentimes clients served with an ACCS may also have other family members in which they're a primary caregiver. So it may be an aging parent or a sibling or someone else in their life, and that regardless of whether you're talking about a child or an aging parent, many of the demands on a person impact them in a similar way. And so we had a lot of discussion on the development of this guidance more than we expected to, but did kind of expand it to include kind of any form of dependent care.
Is this SSM different than level of care being done by DMH? No. So during the level of care review, as we stated earlier, one of the data sources that we consider is the self-sufficiency matrix. So the current practice is that providers are giving those, having the discussion about the self-sufficiency matrix and providing the scores, so the ratings to DMH as a part of that process. So it's really something that's done by the provider. And then in discussion with DMH, particularly if there are changes in the person's status, there may be discussion around updating the self-sufficiency matrix to kind of reflect current and not what was at the time that the matrix was last completed. And I just wanted to also say that we will be working on a more automated way of providers being able to report the self-sufficiency matrix scores, because right now that's in a very kind of manual way in which at the time of level of care that
information is provided to DMH.
Could you give us an example of when we would score someone as 1 in crisis on the physical health disability domain? Julie, do any examples come to mind?
Oh, I'm trying to think. You know, you have someone with, right now, someone with cancer and being able to having great difficulty accessing the specialists or the medical care they need might be an example of a 1. Or, you know, when no medical coverage, they've lost their medical coverage. So, for instance, Mass Health or something didn't get filled out, and they have no medical coverage, and we're having trouble accessing that.
I think, too, we are seeing some situations in ACCS where individuals have complex medical needs in which they're frequently in a medical, experiencing a medical hospitalization, and may also be going for short-term skilled nursing. And in fact, may be going back and forth between the two, and there is kind of question or concern about their ability to return home. And so certainly in that situation, I would rate as a 1.
And then what are some of the areas you have seen under the other domain? So that was other guidance. And I think we mentioned one just right now when we were talking about the dependent care.
Yes, although that, you know, we're instructing to rate within the child care.
Right.
DMH is not using the other. And an individual provider may choose to utilize an other for a domain that's important within their service delivery model. And they may provide further instructions to their staff in how that other is defined, but DMH will not be asking for the other domain. It's a part of the Arizona tool,
Okay.
and so that's why it is present on form.
Okay. Well, I think we have run out of questions unless there's any more. So at this time, we'd like to just wrap up to let people know that we have sent out the self-sufficiency matrix and guidance document to everyone who participated, and it has been included in the materials as the handout. What DMH and ABH would really appreciate is everyone's sort of taking a final look, if you will, because a lot of these questions have been very helpful because we are looking to make sure that we have clarification or we're providing clarification as much as possible for consistency purposes across the Commonwealth. And, you know, just one question that really comes to mind right now, you know, the difference between an SIE and a GLE, and we know right away that that's an area that we need to improve and just make sure that we've covered those bases. So we'd be asking people to reach out and let us know if there's anything that they see that they would ask for clarification on or that they want further guidance on so that we can have that available and put it into sort of the final, if you will, as we're calling it, and we would release that. So I actually see a couple more questions. So let me just get to those since we have a little bit more time left. Does a person need to be at or over retirement age or retired after working for a time and has saved money for retirement to be considered NA in the employment section?
I would say no. It that question. I think, and this is a judgment call, and I think that, there are differing, it is a judgment call, that their ability or their history of saving for retirement would be a non-factor. But I would really would consider kind of both age and health. And so, an individual that, and I won't say an age, but, has significant health issues and is of an age where, they are not reasonably expecting or have an interest in working. For someone who is younger, someone who is 30, 40 years old, saying they don't want to work, but they really don't have health issues that would impact their ability to work, I would recommend rating kind of a one of no job in that situation. We recognize having the NA under there kind of does give a little bit of a judgment call to it, but I think that's the guidance we'd give at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, even in our vignette with Jane, who was in her 50s, but due to her circumstances, but she was calling herself retired. And, but again, it would fall into that category. And as Julie had explained, she was an NA, based upon how she sort of Jane had characterized herself and due to how she sort of felt about where her job options were, if you will. So the next question that we have is, it was noticed that there is a comments or formulation section under notes. Would this need to be separate, or is this part of the clinical formulation in the full CA?
That's a really good, yes. The matrix itself is self-contained. It is the score for each domain and an indication of whether it is a goal for the person or not. The formulation is part of the overall assessment process, and so the self-sufficiency matrix would be one piece of information informing the formulation, but you would not be completing a separate formulation specific to the self-sufficiency matrix.
And the last question, if other is used by a vendor, does it need to be consistent throughout, or can individual clinicians choose to use this field?
That would be a question really for the vendor, would be my preference, as a vendor, so that at least you have consistency within your organization.
I would agree with that.
So back to the wrap up. Again, thank you everyone for participating, and again, we'd really appreciate a review of the matrix. I think these last questions. And there is a question, are these being put into place right away? The SSM, I guess.
Yeah, I think, the self-sufficiency matrix has been in place since the startup of ACCS, and so I would expect that this could be a helpful tool. We recognize that it will, take time for this new guidance to be reflected within ratings for all individuals served within ACCS because of the time frames in which they're completed. But yes, I would begin using it now, and when we do release the final version, we can really kind of call out if there's any substantive changes. I don't expect that there will be any substantive changes, but clarifications like the SIE, like several of the other things that came up, will help us to just give kind of more detailed and complete guidance.
And where can we access the SSM? If it wasn't emailed to you as part of the your enrollment in the webinar, it is actually part of the handouts, and that will be on the far right-hand side of your screen, where you can see your Your control panel, excuse me, I didn't want to call it a dashboard, so thank you, Megan. And you'll see handouts 1 of 5. If you click there, it will bring you down to the self-sufficiency matrix guidance, and then you can just download that information right now, and you can get it, and you'll be all set.
And we can also send it out in an email.
Right, if people need it. And we will also be sending out, it would be part of this, exactly, so. All right, well, thank you to our presenters, Beth Lucas from DMH and Julie Elias from ServiceNet, and thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate your time, and hopefully this webinar was helpful to all of you. Have a great afternoon.